The first time Mark met Michelle, he couldn't help but feel captivated. She moved through the restaurant like she owned the place, her laugh loud and uninhibited, catching the eye of everyone around her. She had this magnetic way of making life feel like a perpetual red carpet event, a high-gloss glamour Mark never knew he craved until she pulled him into it. He was an up-and-coming tech entrepreneur, barely scraping by as he poured everything into his startup. Michelle's world was like nothing he'd ever experienced. Her weekends spent at lavish parties with friends whose names appeared in glossy magazines, the carefully curated designer clothes that hung in her massive closet. Everything about her exuded sophistication, and it thrilled him to think she'd chosen him. But over time, the glow began to fade. It wasn't one single moment, but rather a string of small, almost invisible barbed snide comments Michelle passed off as jokes, reminders that she was the one with real money. A wealthy background that gave her access to connections Mark could only dream of. She'd brush it off whenever he seemed hurt by her words, saying he was too sensitive or overthinking it, but the slights lingered. Michelle made it clear that she was accustomed to a certain lifestyle, and Mark worked hard to keep up. The late nights, the constant hustling, it was all for their future, he told himself. He'd get his startup off the ground, become successful, and then maybe she'd see him as her equal. Until then, he endured the occasional joke at his expense, rationalizing that it was just her way of pushing him to do better. But the pressure never relented. Michelle's demands were endless expensive vacations, dinners at the trendiest restaurants, all for the sake of keeping up appearances. Every time Mark tried to suggest something more modest, she'd brush it off, saying she couldn't imagine dining anywhere less than 5 stars or vacationing anywhere that didn't have a private beach. The financial strain was immense, but he justified it by telling himself that success required sacrifices. Only later would he realize he was the only one sacrificing. It was an ordinary Tuesday night, the kind that usually stretched into the early hours, with Mark's laptop glowing in a quiet office while he plugged away at code. He'd been working late, pushing through a particularly tough phase with investors, hoping to finally secure the funding that would take his company to the next level. By the time he drove home, it was past midnight, and he was exhausted. As he entered the apartment, he noticed Michelle's voice drifting from the living room, hushed but laced with a familiar, flirty tone. She was on the phone. He paused in the hallway, half listening, thinking she was chatting with a friend. But something made him stay. I know, it's ridiculous, she was saying, her voice mocking. He's still going on about that stupid app. Like, at what point do you just admit that it's a lost cause? It's embarrassing. Mark felt his stomach twist, a cold dread washing over him. Was she talking about him? He leaned closer, holding his breath, and his worst suspicions were confirmed. I mean, I thought I married someone with ambition, but he just plays around with his little tech sandbox, she laughed, the sound shrill and biting. I should have married someone with a real career. His hand clenched around the doorknob, knuckles white. But he didn't move. He felt frozen in place, suspended between shock and disbelief. It was one thing to endure her digs in person, to let her criticisms slide off him. But to hear her laughing about him, belittling his dreams behind his back. It cut deeper than he could have imagined. The final blow came when he heard another voice on the phone, a man's. His deep laughter intertwined with Michelle's, and she cooed, telling him in a hushed whisper that she'd rather be with him than some wannabe tech guru. Mark's world fractured. He wasn't just a disappointment in her eyes, he was a joke, a convenient accessory she could discard whenever she wanted. And here she was, openly admitting it to someone else. Mark didn't sleep that night. He sat in the empty living room after she'd gone to bed, her phone call still ringing in his ears. Every moment with her felt like a lie, every affectionate glance and soft smile twisted into something hollow. By morning, he was a different man, hardened by a painful clarity. When she finally emerged from the bedroom, looking perfectly composed in her silk robe, he was waiting at the kitchen table. She started to greet him with a bright, polished smile, but he stopped her with a look. Michelle, he said, his voice barely a whisper. Who were you talking to last night? Her smile faltered for a moment, and then it slipped back into place, only slightly stiffer. What are you talking about? I heard you, he said, eyes never leaving hers. Talking to some man on the phone about how I'm just a joke to you. About how you wish you'd married someone with a real career. Her expression hardened, and he saw the faintest glimmer of panic in her eyes before she masked it. You're being ridiculous, Mark. That was just a friend. We were venting, it's nothing serious. Nothing serious, he repeated, bitterness seeping into his voice. You laughed at me, Michelle. You laughed at everything I've built. She tried to brush it off, saying he was overreacting, but he wasn't interested in her excuses. The weight of her betrayal was crushing, and he knew there was only one way forward. "I'm done, Michelle," he said quietly. "I want a divorce." The color drained from her face, her composure finally shattering. She sputtered, tried to charm him, begged, then cursed him in turns, but his mind was made up. He watched her crumble, the reality of her own actions dawning on her as she realized he was serious. Divorce proceedings began swiftly, and Mark made sure every step of the process remained clean and fair. Michelle's attempts to manipulate the situation were relentless. She tried to rally her friends, whispering rumors about him, portraying herself as the victim. But Mark's reputation spoke for itself, and their social circles soon turned a wary eye toward her. And then came the financial blow. In their prenup, Michelle had insisted on a clause that protected most of her family inheritance. She'd been sure she'd never need his money. But over the years, she'd drained her assets, funding her lavish lifestyle with money he'd earned, hiding her spending habits from him. When their finances were sorted out, she found herself left with nothing more than what she'd come into the marriage with, which, by this point, was almost nothing. Without his income to prop her up, Michelle's lifestyle began to unravel. Gone were the weekends at luxury resorts, the designer outfits, the new car every year. She struggled to maintain the image she'd worked so hard to build, selling off what she could and cutting corners to preserve appearances, but it was never enough. Her high society friends who'd once fawned over her grew distant, their invitations becoming scarce as her wealth slipped away. Her desperation reached a peak when she attempted to reach out to him one last time. She appeared at his office unannounced, a shadow of the woman she once was. She asked to talk, begged him to reconsider, promising that things could be different. But he'd already moved on. "I'm done with the lies, Michelle," he told her, his voice devoid of emotion. "I don't need you to validate me anymore." As she stormed out, defeated and angry, he felt a strange sense of peace settle over him. She was finally gone, her power over him severed. Freed from Michelle's manipulation and condescension, Mark felt a surge of energy he hadn't known he'd been missing. His startup, which had been a source of ridicule to her, became a beacon of hope and purpose for him. Unburdened by her endless demands, he poured himself into the work with renewed passion. Investors began to take notice, and within months, his company experienced a massive breakthrough. His reputation grew, no longer hindered by Michelle's whispers, and his network flourished. It wasn't just about success now, it was about reclaiming the dignity she'd stolen, building a life free from her toxic influence. One evening, he sat on his balcony overlooking the city, reflecting on how far he'd come. His success wasn't just a triumph of his career, it was proof that he could stand on his own, that he was capable of achieving everything she'd once told him he wasn't. And as he looked out over the city lights, he felt, for the first time, truly free. After the divorce, Mark faced a strange period of adjustment. The silence in his apartment felt heavy without Michelle's constant presence, and he found himself revisiting every choice he'd made during their time together, dissecting the ways he'd allowed her criticism to creep into his mind. With each painful memory, though, he began to see how far he'd come since walking away. What he'd lost wasn't love, it was a need to prove himself to someone who'd never truly valued him. He started taking time for himself, learning how to live without the weight of her expectations pressing down on him. He reconnected with friends, some of whom he'd distanced himself from during his marriage to Michelle. They welcomed him back with open arms, almost as if they'd known he'd been living under her thumb all along. Nights out with old friends reminded him of who he'd been before her, a man with dreams, humor, and a quiet confidence she'd systematically chipped away at. Slowly, he felt his sense of self-worth reemerge. Mark's business, once a fledgling startup, now became his sanctuary. With renewed focus, he threw himself into work, and as his success grew, so did his sense of autonomy. Each new client, each investment milestone, felt like another piece of himself restored. Meanwhile, Michelle's world continued to unravel. As the divorce settlement left her with far less than she'd anticipated, she scrambled to maintain her status, but without the finances to support it, her attempts were futile. Her desperation grew visible. Acquaintances who'd once been captivated by her sophistication now watched her falter. Gossip spread about her financial troubles, and those who'd been her friends grew distant, wary of associating with someone whose image was no longer pristine. A few months after the divorce, Michelle showed up at a mutual friend's dinner party, looking noticeably different. She was dressed in high-end knockoffs, a noticeable departure from her usual designer outfits, her expression strained. She tried to keep up her usual charm, but everyone could sense the change. Her friends whispered, exchanging uncomfortable glances. Her confidence, once her calling card, had eroded. She was no longer the queen bee of their social scene, she was just another woman clinging to a lifestyle she could no longer afford. She tried to approach Mark again, leaving him voicemails and sending apologetic texts, filled with thinly veiled attempts to rekindle their connection. She spoke of forgiveness and second chances, but Mark saw through it. She wasn't sorry for how she'd treated him, she was simply desperate to regain her old life. Each message only solidified his resolve to keep moving forward, free from her toxic influence. As his company continued to grow, Mark found himself gaining recognition in his industry. He was invited to speak at conferences, his name appearing in business journals as a rising star in tech. What once seemed impossible, a future he'd hoped to build alongside Michelle, was now something he'd created on his own. But beyond his professional success, he felt a newfound contentment in his personal life. He no longer lived to prove his worth to someone who would never have valued it. Instead, he focused on building relationships with people who genuinely respected him. One evening, Mark attended an industry gala, a formal affair filled with influential people from various fields. It was the kind of event Michelle would have loved: glitzy, high profile, a place to be seen. But as he stood there mingling, he realized he felt completely at ease without her. For the first time, he didn't need her to guide him through these social waters, he was there on his own terms. As the night wore on, he caught the eye of a woman standing by the bar, casually dressed but with an air of quiet elegance. They struck up a conversation, and he was surprised by how easy it felt, no pretenses or hidden agendas. She was grounded, funny, genuinely interested in his work, not because of what it could buy, but because she respected the dedication it took to build something from scratch. Her name was Sarah, a writer who'd built a career freelancing for various magazines, with a fierce independence that resonated with him. They spent the evening talking about everything from their favorite books to the challenges of being self-employed, a refreshing change from the constant comparisons and status games he'd endured with Michelle. He left the event feeling hopeful, wondering if he might finally be ready to open his heart again. Months later, Mark received an unexpected message from Michelle. She wanted to meet, to talk things over. Part of him wanted to ignore it, but he knew he needed the closure. He agreed, arranging to meet her at a small cafe far from the luxurious settings she once demanded. Michelle arrived looking polished but strained, her eyes shadowed with worry. She fumbled through small talk, barely meeting his gaze, and then, with a sigh, she launched into her real reason for the meeting. She spoke of regrets, tried to appeal to the good times they'd had, hoping he might be open to a reconciliation. But her words felt hollow, an echo of the manipulation he'd endured before. "Mark, we were good together once," she said, her voice pleading. "Maybe we can be again." Mark watched her, his mind replaying the years of subtle derision, the way she'd belittled him, mocked his dreams to someone else. He felt a pang of sadness, not for her, but for the man he'd once been, so eager to please, so blind to the harm she'd caused. "Michelle," he replied softly, "you didn't want a partner. You wanted a trophy. And now that your lifestyle is gone, you're hoping to find a way back to it." He shook his head, his voice steady. "I can't be that for you. Not anymore." She tried to interrupt, to protest, but he held up a hand. "You were right about one thing. I wouldn't be here without you. But I've finally learned I don't need you to stay here. Goodbye, Michelle?" He left her there, seated in the cafe that must have felt terribly ordinary to her, her expression unreadable. As he walked away, he felt a weight lift, a final release from the hold she'd had on him. In the months that followed, Mark continued to see Sarah. Unlike Michelle, she didn't care about appearances or social status. She cared about integrity, hard work, and authenticity, qualities that felt like a balm to his old wounds. With her, he felt he could be himself, no longer performing, no longer needing validation from anyone but himself. They traveled together, exploring places he never would have visited with Michelle, places that didn't come with designer price tags or flashy resorts. He introduced Sarah to his friends, his work, his world, and for the first time he felt like he was truly sharing his life with someone. As the year came to an end, his startup hit a major milestone. They celebrated quietly, just the two of them, in a cozy restaurant overlooking the city, a city that, for all its glitter, now felt like his own. They clinked their glasses, and he felt an overwhelming sense of pride, not just for what he'd achieved professionally, but for the strength he'd found within himself.